As everyone is learning now, you don't have to be super technical. You can see what the challenges are coming. I saw an Economist article not like a week and a half ago, maybe a couple weeks ago, talking about how actually AI is now entering a trough of disillusionment, all the way from the executive levels down to even, I would say, individual contributor levels, where people are understanding now that, wow, the hype is huge. And we're just not seeing the returns. We're throwing millions of dollars after millions of dollars and tons of effort hours into these initiatives. And we're not getting this promise that people keep saying. And that is something that we're working through, especially Red Oak. We're actively working through that as well, even on our own offering. So what I want to do today is I want to talk about sort of what our point of view is, some lessons that we've learned just in the last 9 months of rolling out our AI review product, and talk about our point of view, how we approach it, that we think honestly is a game changer. It is different, and it is very, very relevant and specific to how compliance review is done and how document review is done. So before we sort of talk about that, we kind of have to talk first about where we were. So let's talk about where we used to be. So the way that it used to be with AI, training. All right. So training, again, you don't have to be technical or non-technical to even understand, but everyone has heard this term now with regards to AI. If you've, according to these percentages that we've seen in the polls, if people have done training, been responsible for training on initiatives, you know what this is, okay? Effectively, what it means is that in order to actually leverage AI, you first had to be able to, quote unquote, train the AI on not only materials and things like that you wanted it to assess or deal with, but you had to ask it all of the questions, have it try to answer those, and then as well tell it if it was right or wrong, why it was right or wrong. And there would be retraining, and these cycles it involves IT, tons of consulting hours, AI engineers that are specific to these things. Compliance reviewers are responsible for labeling. Everybody has day jobs. It was painful. That is very painful. That's the way it used to be. And there are still solutions out there today that still require this kind of an implementation model. Painful, expensive, it's not controlled by the business owners, and really, really detracts from your day jobs. Okay. And again, you have to go through that only to have to retrain it. Types of material that you have changes, your business rules change, your WSPs change. Guess what? That means we need to retrain, because the ground upon which we walk has now shifted. The model doesn't know it. You have to retrain it again on that kind of stuff. Okay. So why did we need to train so much? The reason why we need to train so much, I like to call it speed dating. That is the metaphor that I love to use it, which is that when you're speed dating, you only have a very small amount of time to put a very small piece of information to get a response, and then you have to take that response and you have to wait for the next round and come back around again, and you have to augment that with what you said before, and you're going to be speed dating multiple rounds in order to get a complete picture. Okay? So the older models, they weren't that smart. Okay. They were smarter than anything we'd ever seen prior. Don't get me wrong, but they still weren't that smart. All right. Very small conversations, which are called context windows. And if you wanted to have a longer conversation, you had to have multiple rounds in your speed dating sessions. Okay. Maybe you could talk about favorite cars in your first one, and that's going to be a very short conversation. But when you get to favorite food and you get to different kinds of things, I'm sorry, you're going multiple rounds on that. And by the way, when you're going those multiple rounds, you have to remind your date what they asked, how they answered you, or you answered last time, and remind them of the past conversation, which means you even have less time as the conversations go on to include the context you want to include. Okay. So in order to overcome those issues with speed dating the model, You had to train the model on every possible aspect or nearly every possible aspect of what you might ask it beforehand. So guess what? That model is incredibly difficult, obviously, right? And I think we've seen even with past editions of like let's say ChatGPT 3, GPT 3.5, where we were having those issues. I mean, anyone who's used ChatGPT has encountered this, right? So then the question is, what are you saying? No more training? So the first thing I'm going to caveat with is training is definitely still relevant in certain use cases and in certain specific kinds of things, especially when we're talking about very domain specific levels of data and analytics and things maybe that aren't publicly available. Perhaps there's not large enough sample sizes out there. Perhaps, it's information that's just more very private, proprietary information, that kind of stuff. But in our industry, okay, I would say easily 95%, at least in terms of ad review, of what is produced is public facing material. So the models that have been trained, whether it's OpenAI training their models, whether it's Anthropic training their models, or Google, there are millions of pieces of financial advertising of all different types, millions that have already been trained on the models, that the models have been trained on. There's no need to give it those massive sample size anymore. Okay. And the newer models, they are easily 10 to 20x smarter. And the future models, especially when we're talking about GPT-5, although separate conversation, realize the rollout was a nightmare and it's actually got some issues that they're dealing with. But even with that, the modern models and the newer ones are going to be incredibly smart. All right. And what's even better is now you don't have to speed date these models. They've expanded what are called the context windows. So imagine now your speed date doesn't have to be a speed date anymore. You can actually have a long dinner date now. You can actually spend a couple hours and have that long, nice conversation, full context, really get the quality. And when the outcome, and the responses come, it's truly meaningful. It's complete, much more than it used to be. So what does that mean? For our purposes, pre-training of models, it's over. So now let's talk about our approach. So I like to call what we're doing disruptive table stakes. And our general table stakes are, we want to reduce risk, we want to improve compliance, we want to reduce noise, improve efficiency, time to market. Those are table stakes, but we got to level it up, okay, a little bit, which is you get IT out of this equation, okay? Which, by the way, there's multiple customers that we're working with right now where that's still a challenge. I'm having to talk to IT teams directly to help them understand why they don't need to be in this equation right now. You got to make it easy to use. And most importantly, we have to put control in the hands of the business owners where it belongs. Many of which are on this call right now. So now our approach, and we had to think about this, but in the end, past becomes prologue. Let's put it that way. And as we struggle to think about how are we going to do this, what is the concepts that we can use to make this easy to use, the idea is we're going to kick it old school, because it really comes back to the way that we used to do things back in the old days, which is that a submission is a manila folder. You remember those little inner office things, and you used to have to string and you tie and you'd put your, that's what a submission is. It's got maybe an intake form. You see here, I've got this little thing, retail, 401k, whatever. And then you open it up and you've got the piece of material that's being reviewed. And then the reviewer would literally look at that thing. And sometimes there'd be a post-it note, a sticky that would maybe different colors to indicate different things. Perhaps we're talking about like highlighting, whatever, right? That's the old model. That's the way we did things old school. And the more we thought about it, we're like, you know what? That just makes sense. Why do we have to make it any more complicated than that? So we went old school. and we created 3 concepts. And I say created, it's really just resurrected. So one of the terms that we use is we call classifications. Those are your post-its and stickies. You see the infab and the P, like that's not fair and balanced, and then P would be promissory, let's say, right? And then you have a prompt. Now, a prompt would be a grouping of those classifications, okay? So not fair and balanced and promissory could be grouped together, like let's say under a FINRA 2210 prompt, okay? And then there's rules. These would be considered more of your supervisory procedures, which every compliance reviewer should know, which is every classification is not going to be applied in all situations. There are very specific classifications, let's say, that have to do with insurance, life annuities, things like that, that do not occur in, like, let's say, a standard retail investment context. Okay, so you have to be able to apply different classifications at different times, and that is done through rules that have to be set up. So now I've said, now a classification, we have definitions of what that is, and I'll talk about that in a second. Prompts, which are groups of those, and rules, which say when those prompts have to run. Okay. Again, this is going back sort of to the disruptive table stakes. Business owners create classifications. Business owners put the definitions and the policies behind those classifications, those post-it notes, those stickies, and they control which prompts run on which kinds of material. There is a through line straight from the vision of who we think should control these things down to the implementation level. You don't see AI engineer here. You don't see IT here. There's no projects that need to be created around that. And it's in the control. It's in the hands of the business owners. Now, let's take a look at classifications. This is an actual screen from our product. This is a sort of a grid view of our classifications. I had to kind of shrink it down for the purposes of this presentation. But as you can see, we have 3 classifications defined here. So like the name of one of these classifications is endorsements and testimonials, PE. So, and look at the definition. If you can read this, it says, third-party statements or portfolio company endorsements. And then you can see in that prompts column that this will be supplied for PE marketing materials specifically. Okay, so it's PE endorsements and testimonials. And then the idea, right, is that, again, the classification, it tells the AI what things you want it to try to identify. So in this case, if the AI is handed a document, it's handed that classification, it's going to read the document and then highlight areas that it thinks identify that qualify as that with that classification. A definition of a classification that you can see in that column, you actually don't need one, but we highly and strongly recommend it because the name of a classification and the definition combined are just give that additional context of instructions to the model so that it knows what to look for. Okay, so it probably should be fairly in depth in terms of what the definition of that classification means. That sticky could come straight out of your written supervisory procedures, but even examples. Tell it, here's an example of one that is, let's say, meets this classification. Maybe give us an example also of one that is not, okay? Again, to help it out. And another piece of classification that's defined is a severity, which is if a finding is found with a particular classification, what kind of a compliance severity in terms of deficiency should be applied to it. And we have 5 levels of severities to choose from because obviously some classifications are far more severe than others. depending on, what you're dealing with. And we do have, you can actually see here that there are informational, which is that it's really not a compliance deficiency. It's just, hey, we'd like to know about it, but it's not a deficiency. Okay. Now let's talk about prompts. We've got 3 prompts here. You can see listed on this screen that, for example, we've got a market commentary prompt. There's a general material for review prompt, and then there's a PE marketing material prompt. And you can see all of the classifications that are associated with those prompts. All right. So a prompt is a grouping of one or more classifications that are intended to be run together. Again, the classifications, they're grouped inside of each of those prompts. Remember, those are the stickies. And then there are rules which determine which prompts should run on a particular type of piece. And you have to have that tie because there's very specific prompts and policies that you want the model to review in certain situations, but not others. And that is not willy-nilly. That actually is highly deterministic. It's not read my piece and just figure it out. It doesn't understand who's your intended audience. What's the jurisdiction? What is the asset class, if applicable? You don't want the AI just to have to, it feels like it's this. There are cases where the AI, it's important to be able to use its sentiment analysis to determine some of these things. But there are situations where you're like, I don't feel like having a hallucination on this. It's insurance. It's a serial regulation. I mean, there's certain things where determinism is important, right? None of us are going to have AIs flying our airplanes anytime soon when we get from point A to point B, right? Now let's look at an actual resulting review. Again, and apologies for the size. You might have to blow up your screen a little bit to see this. But this is an actual review that came out of the product. So the first thing that you'll see is that there's a review posture summary, which is based on a weighted average severity of findings, okay? It's a rudimentary scoring system. Every severity has effectively a numeric value applied to it, and then there's a weighted average of those that comes up with an overall severity score in terms of deficiency. It's not based on a 0 to like 100 kind of scale or anything like that. It's more just of an aggregate score, and then weighted averages accordingly. So, but you can see here in this particular thing, the AI said, it has multiple findings that are high severity, and it related to promissory language, and also, and then it says overall, right, that demonstrates significant compliance risks. So right up front, when you're viewing the document, a reviewer, without reading one word, the AI is at least giving you its opinion overall of kind of where it stands. You still have the responsibility as a reviewer to review the document. This is not a replacement for a reviewer. I was telling someone yesterday, you have to think of this almost like a spelling or grammar checker. You really do. It's not meant to just replace you. It's meant to get you more quickly and more accurately, by the way, to review findings with better quality, faster, more efficiency, and even potentially reduce the numbers of turnarounds. All right. And then you can see the AI agent, like this first thing, we highlighted one here. It has a problem with why play it safe when you can shoot for the moon. Has a problem with that statement. You can see that the classification is promissory, which at least for this client is considered high risk. That's a high risk finding. And it said it could be construed as encouraging speculative behavior, and even suggests an alternate phrase where you might consider it. Now, this is where marketers obviously are going to get a little bit annoyed because the alternate phrases provided by compliance are sometimes don't contain the level of puffery that they would prefer sometimes, but a lot of times to be compliant, you just have to suck it up, and that's what you're going to have to live with. But every finding is going to tell you, here's what the classification to post it is, here's what the sticky says, here's why the AI believes it met that finding, and here's alternate potential phrasing. Okay. So with that, we need to talk about some lessons that we've learned. And we've learned these real time as we've gone through implementations ourselves and working with clients like Cassie and her team and others as well. So we're going to tell you exactly what we've learned because we want to make sure that we're level setting expectations on where we are and where we're going. All right. So the first thing is hallucinations are real. Okay, they're real. I have one small example here of Gemini. Basically, you can see here, parachutes are no more effective than backpacks at preventing death or major injury when jumping from an aircraft. Okay? Of course, it fails to mention that the study was actually done of someone being only like 2 feet from the ground when that study was again, it's basically, has problems. But anyways, we have hallucinations, they're real. And they're caused by many things. Contextual confusion is one, which is that you have classifications rules that basically completely contradict each other. So, for example, I don't want to see something that's promissory. Okay, that's fine. Do you realize that the AI in many situations thinks that the statement past performance is not indicative of future results? That's promissory. If you think about it, it's a disclosure, but it's promissory. So, just one example. Lack of refinement, which means that your classifications perhaps they're just not crisp enough. You need to define them much better. They're too deterministic. People using the AI as a lexicon. It is not a lexicon. Okay. You're not going to be able to do a lot of things that you can do with a deterministic lexicon. All right. But understand, though, that things are getting better all the time. The models are improving. Our backend logic, we're getting better with how we actually aggregate the prompts and actually get our agent to be able to query the model. And we're adding features to improve that AI review lifecycle. Okay. So I was just saying it's not a lexicon. I'll spend a couple more seconds and just say, listen, you want to use the right tool for the right job. All right. What you don't want to do is to say, ensure that all corporate entities have an appropriate trademark symbol. The model is not going to have like access to the current public database on what needs service marks or trademarks necessarily internationally. And look, there are certain things that are not appropriate for an AI. It's much better at sentiment-based kind of stuff. If you see something that looks like X, if you see something that might violate X, it's much better at that. Okay. And lastly, we take one small bite at a time. Each classification to individually test it and refine it before going to production. Work iteratively with our implementation team as we go through each classification. And each classification one by one should be promoted to production. You don't want to do everything all at once, big bang, okay? Because otherwise you can get hallucinations due to possible classification collisions, okay? We really want to make sure that we do things iteratively and incrementally. And lastly, we're never done. We are continually improving. We're improving our backend logic at all the time based on feedback from real life usage. We're adding more features to support the improvement of the product. And we're going to be adding reporting to help the business owners see what classifications are working and what's not so that those can be improved incrementally over time by business owners. And more features to come. This is the very last slide here, which is, for example, we have imminent delivery where you'll be able to hide AI agent reviews from, like, let's say, submitters and only show them to reviewers. That's actually going to be delivered imminently here. We have an AI review vision agent, which will actually even look at images to see if those images are compliant. You know, the person pushing a wheelbarrow full of gold, and an AI transcription agent, which is actually going to be completed probably in the next couple months. And that's actually going to do AI-based transcription of audio video files and then actually do AI review of those transcriptions for compliance purposes. Super, super awesome. So again, roll out that AI review module and then bring the rest of our features in and leverage that tool set to really give that power to apply the power of AI and agentic AI into the functionality that we already have.